All right, we're going to start talking about World War II. And just like with World War I, we're going to kind of go through and look at various causes, various happenings, and various things that are going to carry forward into the future. We're not interested so much in dates and battles, although to some extent those things are important because it's part of the historical process. However, if all you do is memorize dates and battles and soldiers and armies and various things like that, we will never get to what we can take from history and begin to ask more important questions, like how does somebody like Adolf Hitler come to power? How can a whole nation of people be duped into following him? What does he use in order to become powerful? How does he convince people to follow him? And how can those same mistakes be avoided again later in the future? We don't want another Holocaust. We don't want another Nazi Germany. We don't want more leaders like Adolf Hitler gaining control of countries. And when we see these things beginning to happen today in our world, we need to take whatever steps are necessary to stop them, because the end result is something like World War II, which we're going to see is not very pretty at all. So we're going to focus more again on these themes than just the individual battles, individual dates or things like that. You see on you or on the screen in front of you is a picture of the flag raising on Iwo Jima. We're going to get to that when we begin talking about the Pacific Theater and some of the difficulties that the Allied soldiers will face in the Pacific. But what we're going to do right now at the beginning is just kind of go through and look at the different Axis powers, the three primary Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, and we're going to figure out what caused them to enter into the war or to begin fighting the war, and how maybe that could have been avoided as we go through the rest of the lesson. Okay, so first, foremost, the most commonly discussed probably in World War II is the Third Reich, or Germany. And so some of the questions that we need to know is what caused Germany to want the Second War. They didn't happen into it. They didn't get pulled into it. Nobody attacked them. They were the primary instigators of the war in Europe. They were searching for another war. And so the questions we have to ask is, why did that happen? And could it have been avoided? Well, at the end of World War I, you remember you have the armistice in November of 1918. The war is officially over in 1919. You're going to see a similar thing in World War II. There will be an armistice day, and then there will be an official ending day. What you're going to see at the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 is that Germany was treated very, very poorly after the war. Everybody wanted somebody to blame. The war couldn't have been because a bunch of people made stupid decisions. It had to be somebody's fault. And so they blame Germany. By and large, France in particular stresses the fact this is Germany's fault. And so Germany winds up having to pay for the war. They're going to have to pay money to the Allied powers, mostly France and Great Britain, and some to Russia, and they will have to pay for the entire war. It's going to devastate the German economy. And you can look here in this chart that's on your screen. It's right here. This chart tells you how much a German mark was worth. The German mark is like our dollar. It's actually called a Reichsmark, or it was called a Reichsmark. And it's a dollar, basically. When I was over in Germany in the early part of the 2000s, the exchange rate for Reichs and dollars was roughly 2.5 Reichsmarks, or Deutschmarks they're called now, for a dollar. And so look in January 1919, 170 marks could buy an ounce of gold. That's not bad, actually. That's a pretty stable, pretty solid economy, and that's at the end of the war. And so even with all the economic turmoil that might have come along with fighting a protracted war, which nobody expected, the Reichsmark, or the mark, is still pretty strong. But then it doesn't take long. You go from January to September, and look at that inflation. It's unbelievable how quickly this inflation is happening. If you had $100 in the bank in January, in September, now you had 20. Inflation is staggering. By 1923, in November, look at that. 87, not million, not billion, but 87 trillion marks to buy 1 ounce of gold. That's off the charts, inflation. Well, what had happened is you basically destroyed the German economy at the end of World War I. You took away all of its colonies, you took away all of its territories, you shrunk the size of the country by 13%, you split parts of it in half, you took away some of its territories and said, we'll decide at a later date, or some of the actual parts of Germany, we'll decide at a later date whether or not they're going to vote themselves back into Germany. And so there's all kinds of just terrible things that are happening. And you're putting the stress on Germany, the extra stress of having to pay for everybody's war costs. That's not going to happen. And so what you wind up with is by 1923, it costs like 4.5 trillion marks. 4.5 trillion, with a T, trillion marks to buy a loaf of bread. 4.5 trillion marks to buy a loaf of bread. That was the state of the German economy in 1923. Out of that, the Nazi Party will be born. The Nazi Party will see the terrible stagnation that is happening to the German economy. The rest of the world will follow shortly after. You can't destroy one of the key economies in the world and not expect there to be ripple effects. You can't throw massive amounts of money, currency, into other countries' economies, which Germany was being forced to do. So France and Britain and other countries are receiving an influx of money without harming their economies. The same thing would happen to Rome in ancient world. As Rome became more and more powerful and conquered more and more territory, and they kept sending money back to Rome, it got to the point where money didn't really mean too much. There was just so much of it. Well, that's going to happen in other places, and you're going to have a huge economic collapse in the 20s and 30s. The world economy will kind of go away for a little while. And so, very similar to the way that we have seen recently the economies of whole countries collapse. That's going on in the 20s and 30s. Well, the Nazi Party will be born out of that in the early 20s. In February 24th, actually, is the day that the Nazi Party is founded. And so what you're going to see is the Nazi Party will be born in order to bring Germany back to its pre-war glory. That was the idea, to rescue Germany from the weak, cowardly, spineless politicians who sold her out, who sold out the fatherland in order to end the war and keep themselves comfortable. You see, at the end of the war, the German Reich will be dissolved and they'll begin a new government called the Weimar Republic. And what will happen, it's because of the Weimar Deutsches Republik, the Weimar Republic of Germany is the way we would say it in English. And what you're going to have is there was a lot of resentment from people who felt like this new government sold out Germany. They wanted to end the war. It was very unpopular. It was very unpopular everywhere. But the Germans were the first ones to capitulate and say, all right, we've had enough. They get punished. So most of the population blamed the government for the terrible situation. It was their fault that they quit the war. It was their fault that they now made it cost $4.5 trillion, 4.5 trillion marks to buy bread. And Hitler is going to latch onto that. He's going to use this terrible economic situation in order to rebound Germany. He's going to turn their situation around economically. He's going to turn it around militarily. He's going to turn it around in a wide variety of ways. And if he didn't go crazy bonkers and start killing people and doing all kinds of terrible things, he would have been perhaps one of the greatest leaders in the history of the world. In fact, he's named Time Magazine's Man of the Year. He does such a great job. Now, that was before everybody knew he's crazy bonkers. But when he is doing this, turning the country around, he's doing it because he sees Germany as, he envisions this, enduring, eternal Reich, the German Empire. Again, that idea of nationalism that we talked about last time is deeply steeped into his thinking, and it's going to affect what he does, and it's going to give people a reason to follow him, as we'll see in a little while. Another player in the Axis powers is Italy. Italy, a different story in World War I. They weren't one of the bad guys. Well, they were, and then they weren't, and then they kind of were, and then they weren't. And Italy was kind of like, you see on soap operas where there's a few people and they all date each other like 10 million times before one of them gets married, then they all die and come back to life. Kind of like that in World War I, except there's no resurrections. Italy can't decide which side, which team they want to be on. They go back and forth and back and forth. They're constantly switching teams, trying to find out who's going to give them the best deal for their participation in the war. It's like buzzards, flying around looking for the most lucrative carcass to latch onto. Who's going to give us the most stuff? Well, France and Great Britain promised Italy more than the other side. And so Italy said, okay, I'll fight on your team. Well, after the war, when you have somebody who's bouncing around like that, you might offer them things because you want some extra soldiers to help you fight, but you're probably really not going to pay them because they're not trustworthy. And you know that as soon as the other side comes along and says, hey, we'll pay you twice what they are, they're gone. Right? There's no loyalty there. And so at the end of the war, it also didn't help that Italy didn't pay nearly as much in human blood and material and money as France and Great Britain did. And so at the end of the war, when everybody's tired of fighting, and Italy comes along and says, hey, you promised us all these great things, the countries who really suffered and struggled to fight the war and end the war don't feel like paying up. And so they don't. So Italy gets really mad and says, fine, then we're going to take our toys and go home, and we're going to blow your toys up. And so that's what Benito Mussolini decides to do. He's eventually going to find, again, this root of resentment amongst the people because they weren't getting what they wanted. And basically, Benito Mussolini is going to show up at the square or the center where the government officials meet. He's going to go up to the president and he's going to say, hey, I'm the leader now. And they'll say, okay. And so Benito Mussolini becomes the fascist dictator of Italy. It's probably his hat. I'm sure when he rode up, they were terrified that he was going to poke him with his feather or something, and so they just said, you can be the leader. It was amazing. The people were rallying behind him. There's a huge march. He rode into the capital, and he left the capital the new leader of Italy. Not a great way to select leaders, but that's what they did. The next one we're going to talk about, by the way, Italy is very important in World War II. They do a lot of interesting things, and they kind of get glossed over because Germany was so terrible. And then Japan is on the other side of the world. And so when you talk about the European theater, we tend to focus on Germany, and Italy just kind of gets skipped over. But they're important too. And then the other theater, the major player for the Axis powers in the other theater is the Nipponese Empire, or as you may be familiar with President Roosevelt calling them, the Empire of Japan. You see here in the red, this is the Nipponese Empire at its height. During the conflict, they had the Philippine Islands down here. That was U.S. territory. They took it away. And so this is the height of the Nipponese Empire during World War II. Here you have the Emperor Hirohito, who, interestingly enough, after the war, will remain emperor. Usually when you go through and there's this massive bloody conflict like you have in World War II, you kind of dismantle the government, but they don't do that to Japan. Japan is allowed to keep Emperor Hirohito, and Japan, even to this day, has an emperor. It's still technically the Empire of Japan, although they don't really call it that because it's kind of leaves a bad taste in everybody's mouth. But there is still an emperor, not a king. They don't call him a king. He is the emperor of Japan, and he's related to Hirohito. And so up in this northern picture here, it's not really northern, I tricked you. Yeah, up in this picture right here, these are Japanese soldiers. The Japanese culture for many years was based around the, we like to call it like the code of the samurai. It's the Shinto is their religion, it's their ancestor worship. It has highly formalized, if you remember when we talked about Japanese religion, it's highly formalized, highly ritualized, long sets of detailed rituals that you enter into, and the warrior code, so to speak, will be transferred from samurai to soldiers throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s. Japan is going to be one of the allies, one of the good guys in World War I, and they're going to seek to expand throughout Asia. They want to control Asia. Again, they kind of felt left out at the end of World War I when all the goodies are being handed out. They didn't get any, and so they're kind of upset. And so they begin to expand into Asia, and they're going to do a very good job of it. They're going to become a very big threat. Russia will be terrified that Japan will attack Russia. When Hitler, we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves, but later when Hitler will invade Russia in Operation Barbarossa, where he will invade Russia after he promised not to, Stalin is terrified that Japan will invade Russia, and if Russia had been forced to fight a war on two fronts, they would have lost. There were not enough Russian soldiers to fight the Germans and the Japanese. Well, actually, the Germans and Italians and the Japanese. World War II would have ended very differently if Japan had attacked Russia instead of the United States. So thankfully, and I think that God had a big part in that, because there were people in Japan who were urging the military leaders to attack Russia. Germany kind of wanted Japan to attack Russia, and it didn't happen. So thankfully, things happened the way that they did. Even though it's terrible that Pearl Harbor will wind up being attacked, the opposite would have been much worse. If Japan had attacked Russia, World War II would have ended differently, and who knows, we might be speaking German or Japanese or Italian. And so, good thing things happened the way that they did. Hindsight's 20/20. Nobody wants to be attacked, but it turned out for the best. So this warrior culture here is going to be transferred to these soldiers. And interesting thing about the Japanese soldiers, they would carry into battle swords. Some of the officers from older families, again, we talked about the class systems that were in place primarily in the European countries in World War I. Those were still kind of in place in World War II. They're still kind of in place in Japan even to this day. They would carry swords into combat. And the United States military in World War II had to train their soldiers specifically how to fight hand-to-hand combat against somebody wielding a sword, because the Japanese carried swords into battle, even in World War II. We kind of think that those things would be outdated or outmoded, but no, the Japanese carried them into World War II. So those are kind of your big three players. All of them have some kind of resentment about the way that World War I ended. And so one of the big things that we need to learn before we even get into talking about any of the fighting is that you've got to be very careful in the way that you resolve conflict. If you do not resolve conflict in a way that makes it possible for everybody to win, even if they lose, the losers have to be winners. If you don't resolve, that's why Emperor Hirohito will stay the emperor of Japan after World War II. They did not want another situation where they have World War III because the Japanese were unhappy with the way World War II ended. So you learn, and you have to learn, or you're going to make the same mistakes, and you're going to wind up repeating yourself, and people usually die when we do the same stupid things over and over and over. So, very important that we learn from these mistakes. And so we're going to see that as we begin to now look at the reasons, or kind of delve into the combat and how things began in Europe, how they began over in Asia, and how they ended, and then the repercussions, the ripple effects that we're still feeling from the war even to this day. We're going to talk about some of the things that Germany did during the war. We're not going to look at some of the most graphic things. One of the things we learn about World War II is the depths of depravity when human beings begin to see other human beings as less than human or like they're animals. It's amazing the terrible things that we're capable of doing to one another. One of the greatest lessons is that as dark as it gets, that darkness can never conquer the light. And there are people who witness and live through terrible things to come out of that dark and bring great light and hope to the world around them. What you see on the screen in front of you is the slogan of the Auschwitz work camp. Arbeit macht frei. Work makes you free. Work sets you free. People were brought there and told it was a work camp, and systematically they were murdered. The Nazi Party in Germany would be based on several things that we need to make sure we remove from our politics. It was based on fear. The German people were afraid that their economy would collapse, that their country would flounder, that nothing would go back to the way it was supposed to be. The German people were full of hatred, many of them. They hated the French, they hated the British for treating them in what was viewed as a very unjust way. They hated the Hebrew people, the Jews. And this hatred goes back centuries. The World War II was not the beginning of hatred for Jewish people in Europe. And revisionist history, our own revisionist history, what we do when we go back, we read love for the Jewish people into history. And it's these mean, nasty Germans who come along and hate them and kill them. That's not true. Europeans have a long-standing history of disregarding Jewish people as being less than human. In the 1200s, there were some laws passed by various religious officials which made it illegal for Jewish people to go into the streets and cities during the daylight hours of the week leading up to Easter. Because they were afraid that villagers, it was for the Jewish people's protection, they were afraid that villagers in these various towns would be so incensed over the fact that the Jews put Jesus to death that they would kill them in the streets. There were always rumors about Jews killing Christian children and baking bread with their blood, and all kinds of terrible stories all throughout history, the history of Europe and other places about Jewish people. Basically, what it comes down to is the Germans or the Jewish people were able to fill historically what are called middle positions. Not the middle class, but middle positions. Like you would have the peasants and you would have the very wealthy nobility when you had the feudal system in place. Well, you still needed bankers and lawyers and very skilled craftsmen like jewelers. And what would happen is because the nobility didn't want the peasants to fill these middle positions and gain, power, not only prestige in having some kind of worthwhile duty, but economic power, making money. And so they looked for people to come in and fill these gap positions, these middle positions. And the Jewish people would do that. They would come in and be the banker. They would come in and be the lawyer. And so the wealthy people looked down on them as not worth being subject. They're not worthy subjects. That's why they're allowed to have those middle positions. The lower class peasants looked down on them because they were coming in and taking the wealth away from them, taking the jobs that they would have liked to have. And so everybody hated them. And so there's this long-standing history of hatred for Jewish people in various places, especially in Europe. And Hitler capitalized on that. Not only were these other countries terrible for the way they treated us at the end of World War II, but it's those Jews. The Jews, they've always been a thorn in the side of German prosperity. They've always been a thorn in the side of German solidarity. And he was able to convince many, many, many people that their fears and their hatred and the deepest, darkest, most sinister thoughts that they have are correct. That type of thing is beginning to happen in our country today, in our society today. When you see divisive people going around trying to instill hatred in one another or play off of fears or play off of misgivings, that is exactly what Adolf Hitler was able to do. Very rarely does it get taken to the level that he took it, but it's all heinous, it's all terrible, it's all disreputable, it's all disgusting, and it's all ultimately the same thing that he did. He was just better at it than almost everybody else. Crazy, but brilliant. And so what you see is something that I hope you will never forget. These gates to these prisons where people were bought and systematically destroyed because they weren't German, because they were different. They didn't fit the mold of the expected society for the Eternal Reich. We can never let that happen again. That's our never forget. Never forget what caused these terrible things, because we can't let them happen. We can't ever let them happen again. Never forget. Never. Burn this image into your mind. Learn these words and learn how terrible they are and the horrible, horrific things that came along with them. In World War II, the start date for World War II, there's a lot of debate about it. Did it start when Japan invades China in 1937? Did it start before that? There's another conflict with Japan and Russia in 1935. Did it start then? Did it start in 1939 with the German invasion of Poland? Did it start later than that? When does it officially become a world war? Does it not become a world war until the United States is involved? Is it not a world war until Russia is involved, fighting, both Japan and Germany? When is it a world war? It's hard to tell, and so there's a lot of debate about the beginning date. When does it start? I tend to believe that the actual beginning date of the war, the things that set it in motion, is in 1919 at the Treaty of Versailles. When did the fighting actually start? The war started in 1919. When did the fighting start? 1935, 1937, 1939, Spanish Civil War, invasion of Poland. Fighting begins in all those places and all those times. Just because it doesn't start everywhere at the same time doesn't mean that the war hasn't begun. It would be like saying that the United States is never at war until somebody attacks the United States. Well, in that case, we've been at war only very few times in our nation's history. And so the war begins in the 1930s, not 1941, when the United States gets involved. The war has been going on for years at that point. And what will happen is Germany is looking for Lebensraum. Lebensraum is a German phrase. It means living space, breathing room, life room, a room to live. And they need space, because remember, Versailles took 13%, 15% of Germany away, divided parts of Germany in half. It took all of its territories, all of its colonies away. So Germany now is claiming that they need room. And so in 1938, they will instigate or start what is called the Anschluss, and that means union in German, Anschluss, and that is the annexation or the union between Germany and Austria. Not long after that, they'll begin to put things into practice that will begin to solidify their power, and they'll begin to push Hebrew people out, or push the Hebrew people out. Some things that Hitler will do to solidify his power is he will stage several different catastrophes. One will be a beer hall putsch, in which he will attempt to overthrow the government. He's captured, thrown in prison. He writes Mein Kampf, which is basically just a long, rambling diatribe describing how he is a poor me, basically, and everything is to be blamed on other people, and particularly the Jews. Everybody's out to get him. Poor me. Mein Kampf means my struggle, my fight in German. There will also be, after Hitler gets out of prison, for some reason, people begin to follow him, and he will stage several different catastrophes that will kind of elevate his position. He will probably set the Reichstag building on fire, which is where, like, the German Congress was meeting. He sets that on fire and claims that the communists did it. And so overnight, he's able to get everybody who's a communist, because remember, Russia's a communist country, and everybody's afraid that the communists are going to come take over their countries. So fear, right? They're afraid of the commies. And so he's going to have all the communists thrown out of the Reichstag overnight. That makes the Nazi Party then the most powerful political party in Germany. And he will have what we call brown shirts now go throughout Germany and rough people up if they wouldn't vote for Nazis. And so the Nazis democratically begin to take over the country. It gets to the point where Hitler is able to convince the president. Hitler is the chancellor of Germany. He is able to convince the president that in order to protect the people of Germany, the president needs to declare emergency powers to cut off all democratic elections and allow Hitler to take control of the military so that he can protect the people. It's put up to a vote, and the people decide that's a good idea. So the chancellor gives Hitler, or the president gives Hitler, emergency powers. He becomes basically the evil Emperor Palpatine, but a real one. And now you have Germany under the control and power of the Nazi Party, and it will be until 1945. Germany then will begin invading places. They will invade Poland. That will cause France and Great Britain to declare war on Germany. Germany will then turn around and invade France and completely take over the country and very, very quickly, using what is called Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Blitzkrieg, lightning war. And they're able to use dive bombers. They're able to use APCs, armored personnel carriers. They're able to use tanks. to move very quickly across the battlefield. Several German commanders were doing their homework before the war began. They studied various conflicts like the Spanish Civil War. They saw how tanks could be used to increase maneuverability and mobility across battlefields, and they recognized that the key to victory is to strike quickly, strike hard, and strike with lots of firepower. Tanks let you do that, but you also had to have armored personnel carriers. You had to move your soldiers. They had to stay with the tanks because you actually need infantry to protect your tanks. You need airplanes. So the airplanes, they developed dive bombers to bring bombers and fighters, maneuverable fighters, up to the front very quickly. Amazing how quickly they're able to take over territory. It takes the rest of the world a while to kind of adapt to what is going on. England is caught off guard, and almost the Army of England leaves at Dunkirk to get back to England. They are almost pushed into the sea. England almost is out of the war before they're in the war. France is out of the war as the war is beginning. And so at the end of 1939, 1940, the only European nation fighting Hitler is Great Britain. That's where you had the Battle of Britain, and that's where Britain will depend heavily upon other countries, in particular the United States, to give it supplies. That'll create tension between Germany and the United States, come into play later when we talk about Japan. Hitler will sign the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, which is basically an agreement between the USSR and Germany that they will kind of divide up Europe, and you take some and we'll take some. They get their own spheres of influence, and we won't kill each other. So Hitler signs this, knowing very well that he's going to break it later. He has plans in place to invade the Soviet Union when the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact is signed. And so then he will begin what is called Operation Barbarossa, named for Frederick Barbarossa, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Barbarossa, 1941, the largest invasion in the history of mankind. There's a 3,000-kilometer battle line. There are over 4 million soldiers involved in the initial fighting. It's the greatest offensive, greatest invasion in the history of the world, Operation Barbarossa. The ability of the German military to pull this off is very impressive from a numerical standpoint. What they're about to do when they enter into these places and when they take Poland in 1939 is horrible. And when we begin to look at some pictures, I will let you know when you should not look if you have a weak stomach. But people in the Ukraine initially are overjoyed to see the Germans. They can't wait to meet them and talk to them. The Germans come in, they're heroes. They're getting rid of the bad communists who are very oppressive to people in the Ukraine. And here you have young girls, cheering as the German soldiers ride in their vehicles and their motorcycles and their APCs. Here you have a German soldier, a German officer actually, sharing chocolate with a young Ukrainian girl. And so the Germans come in and they're heroes. At least this advanced part of the German military are called heroes. In Operation Barbarossa, because remember, Germany's never again is that the people back home have to be taken care of so that they won't betray the soldiers. Notice what you have up here pulling some of these carts and wagons. You have horses pulling. Here's another horse up here in this picture. And so even though the Germans have developed this tactic for blitzkrieg in Operation Barbarossa, which is what these pictures are from, this invasion of Russia, they are not completely mechanized and they're not completely modernized, which means when the conflict becomes protracted and they begin to lose equipment, they're going to be in a bad spot because they have horses pulling equipment. And they are not mobilized and not motorized because they've been spending so much time and effort back home. They've been trying to keep the people happy rather than giving the soldiers what they need. And so you can see here in these photos, this is the invasion of Russia, Operation Barbarossa in full swing. And the Germans are spectacularly successful at first. It's amazing how much ground they're able to cover, how much ground they're able to conquer, but Russia is a big country. What you see here in these next couple of images are some wicked human beings, absolutely wicked human beings. Hitler was not afraid to use psychopaths in order to accomplish his goals, insane people to get his work done. Here on the right, this guy, you have Reinhard Heydrich. He is the architect of what is known as the final solution. To get Lebensraum, it was necessary to go in and remove undesirable people. That would include the Jews, it would include the Gypsies, it would include homosexuals, it would include Ukrainians, it would include Slavs, it would include anybody who didn't live up to the German ideal. And the German ideal was not blonde hair and blue eyes. I know everybody thinks that, but that's not what we were after, right? Because the Führer, no blonde hair, no blue eyes. We were not after physical characteristics per se, although that kind of became the poster child for the Nazi German perfection, the Norse perfection. But what it actually was the German blood. You had to have the German blood in you. Because remember, we still have this concept of races that's carrying over from the 1800s. We saw it in World War I, we're seeing it again in World War II, and it's absolutely stupid. There are not races of people. There are not races of people. There's the human race. There may be a wide variety of cultures. There are not different races. There's just one race, humans. The moment we begin to see different races, the moment we begin to see different types of human beings, we are able to classify them and rank them and categorize them, and all of a sudden now we have worthwhile human beings and unworthy human beings. That's where this kind of stuff gets started. It's dangerous. We have to get that out of our thinking because God never does that. There's just people, and God loves all of them. This guy on the left, remember right here we have Heydrich, architect of the final solution to get Lebensraum for Germany. It was to kill all those undesirables. And so he puts together some ideas on how to do that. You can see, I mean, look at his face. He's cuckoo crazy. Over here on the left, you have a man by the name of Dr. Ohlendorf. And Dr. Ohlendorf would be part of what is called Einsatzgruppen. The Einsatzgruppen were basically soldiers who would come in after the invasion force, and they would mop up and get rid of the undesirable people. The sad thing is that in many places the Einsatzgruppen were able to get their neighbors to identify who was Jewish and who wasn't. And the Einsatzgruppen would come in and they would kill the Jewish people. They would kill the homosexuals, the Gypsies, the Slavs. And the sad thing is, the Germans, when they came in, they couldn't pick out the Jews, which tells you what? That they're not different, that everybody's the same. They're Polish, they're Ukrainian, they're Crimean, there's no distinction. You don't go, oh well, this guy's obviously a Jew. No, he's Polish, he's a Pole. And so they would get there and they would convince their neighbors to sell them out. And then the Einsatzgruppen would come along and gather them up, usually take them out into a field somewhere, have them dig a grave, and shoot them all. That's what the Einsatzgruppen did. They were shock troops, and they came in afterwards, and they cleansed the impure people out of the territory that Germany would take. Millions upon millions of civilians are killed in World War II. And it's not because of stray bullets. It's not because of bombs that miss their mark. Sometimes millions and millions and millions of civilians are killed because Nazi Germany and Japan, as we'll see, go on these terroristic attacks where they destroy and kill civilian populations. If you don't like disturbing images, don't watch the screen for a little bit. Remember all those people who were so happy to see the Germans come in? This is what the Einsatzgruppen would do. They would take them out into fields and they would shoot them. This is the iconic image of the Einsatzgruppen moving through Europe and Eurasia. The reason why it's so powerful is because you can see something so dramatically human. There is a mother holding her child, and when she is standing in front of the firing squad, she does something that only a mother would do. She shields her child from the Nazi soldiers using her body. A last-ditch attempt to keep her child alive. This is what the German soldiers were doing after they came through, after they were giving these children chocolate. This is what they did. Another picture, if you remember those young ladies who were greeting the German soldiers as they came in, the Einsatzgruppen would come and they would strip them of their clothes and parade them through the street and then bring them to a wall and shoot them. These children are being loaded into a train car to be sent back to Germany to work in labor camps. The young people were typically not sent to death camps. The German soldiers had no use for young people. They couldn't do anything, and so they would load them into train cars like cattle, ship them off to Germany, and put them to work. Over half of the children who are loaded into this train car would die on the journey there. In the territories that Germany would conquer or get into conflict with, the death toll from starvation was catastrophic. This poor little girl has died on the steps of her house because her parents were killed and nobody fed her. This would lead to the Russians beginning what were called, they would basically start rebel fights. They were partisans, and they would do anything they could to disrupt the Nazis. Here you see again these young ladies who at one point were greeting the Germans. Now they have rifles strapped to their back, and they're doing anything and everything they can to stop the Germans. What would happen, and it's wonderful to see it, the Russian soldiers, actually, as they're going along, this is a group of sailors on a boat, that when they would go through and they would find these children whose parents died, they would adopt them. And so this little girl has been adopted by the soldiers or the sailors on this boat, and they would care for her and feed her throughout the war. And at the end of the war, one of them would take her home. And so not everything is bad, but the horrific thing about all of this is that those soldiers in the Einsatzgruppen were volunteers. They volunteered for it. Nobody made them do it. Nobody forced them to do it. Nobody threatened to hurt them. They volunteered to do it. So you have an entire nation of people, an entire group of people who have allowed fear and hatred and closed-mindedness to dominate their thinking, and it results in horrific events. Horrific events. Each one of these soldiers here, part of the SS, the Sturmsoldaten, and the Einsatzgruppen, every soldier you see here volunteered to mercilessly and brutally kill other human beings. It should never happen again, ever. There's a reason why wearing Nazi propaganda paraphernalia, there's a reason why giving the hand-out salute, there's a reason why goose-stepping are illegal in Germany, because these things should never, ever, ever happen again. What you have here, dealing with Germany and the invasion of Russia, you have here the three heads of the primary players left. Remember, France is gone. You have Joseph Stalin, you have Theodore Roosevelt, and you have Winston Churchill. They would meet a few times throughout the course of the war. At the very beginning, in 1941, Joseph Stalin was begging the Allies to invade Europe. He wanted them to invade Europe because he could not stop Germany. And remember, he's terrified that Japan is going to attack. Please invade Europe. Well, Roosevelt and Churchill don't really like Stalin. He's a commie. And so they decide to invade Africa. And they delay invading Europe until really 1944. They're going to invade Sicily and Italy before that, but those are very minor engagements, relatively speaking, and they don't draw much of Germany's attention away from the Eastern Front. And so not until 1944, really, does Joseph Stalin get any help. This is going to create an intense amount of hatred and distrust between Joseph Stalin and the other world leaders, and that is the reason why the Cold War will begin, because when he cries out for help in 1941, nobody comes, and Joseph Stalin is not used to asking for things and nobody coming. And so he is going to resent very strongly the United States and Great Britain and what he would see as those capitalist pigs. He would resent them, and he would really want nothing to do with them once he didn't need them anymore. And so the fact that the United States and Great Britain, it's not necessarily their fault, but the fact that they ignored his cries for help and did other things until they got around to creating a second front in Europe really caused a lot of tension there, and we still feel the tension today. When we feel like we can't trust Russia and Russia feels like they can't trust the United States, there's just a long history of bungled decisions and poor relationships where the people don't take the time to sit down and actually talk and think they're going to do what they want to do, causes all these different kinds of problems. What's going to happen along the Eastern Front is most of the soldiers who are killed in combat are killed in the Eastern Front. 95% of Germany's casualties happen on the Eastern Front. 95%. That means 5% are killed other places. Now we think, oh, the United States came in 1944 and we really gave it to those Germans. No, we didn't. The Russians did. 95% of German casualties come from the Russian front. 95%. 50% of the soldiers killed, roughly 50%, in the years leading up to the invasion of Europe, or after the invasion of Europe, 50% of the soldiers are killed along the Eastern Front. Along the Eastern Front, the average life expectancy for a Soviet soldier is 1 day. 1 day. At one point, a Soviet soldier was killed every 20 seconds. So every 20 seconds, another person would die. The death toll is catastrophic. It's the largest invasion in history. It's one of the largest death tolls in history. It is unbelievable how many people will be killed, how many soldiers will be killed, and on top of that, how many civilians will be killed. But at one point, the average life expectancy for a soldier is a day, and one soldier dies every 20 seconds. There are entire outfits, entire units that will be just wiped out of existence during some battles. However, eventually the tide will turn, and the Soviets and the Allied forces, the United States military here, so the United States and Russia, meet at the River Elbe on April 25th, 1945, and that is close to the time when they will finally finish fighting. They've met in Europe, and now when Germany is defeated, the Cold War will begin. They will divide Berlin in half. They'll argue over who gets what. And Russia has its soldiers in Europe. The United States has its soldiers in Europe. And it's actually maybe a mini miracle that World War III didn't happen, or that World War II didn't keep going, and the United States and then Russia were going to be fighting over Europe. Thankfully, it didn't. There would be lasting repercussions over allowing Russia, or over Russia's invasion into Europe. The Soviet Union will be firmly entrenched in the regions that the Russians capture, and that entrenchment, or that long-standing invasion, is not undone until the late 80s and early 90s. And so there's going to be a lot of ripple effect from this. So now we're going to kind of turn our attention over to the Eastern Theater, and we're going to look at the war in the Pacific. Over in the Eastern Front, Japan, the Nipponese Empire, was going to set their sights first on Asian countries like China, and the idea was that the Japanese were the salvation of Asia. They were the ones who were going to get Asia back from the Europeans. Because remember, the Europeans, especially through World War I, had been dividing the world up, and you get this part, we get this part, and they had been doing that over in Asia. And the Japanese saw themselves as the only independent and strong enough nation to drive out the European invaders. They saw the other Asian races, again, this concept of races, they saw the other Asian races as weak and in need of Japan's help, and especially the Chinese. They saw them as collaborators with the foreigners, and they saw them as weak and unworthy of being called Asian in many regards. And so what would happen is the Japanese needed a reason to invade China. And so not only do they have these political or personal reasons, these cultural reasons, but they also have political reasons in that China is a wealth of natural resources. And so Japan, not having very many of her own natural resources, needs to get them from somewhere. And so they can kind of kill two birds with one stone. They can get rid of the weak people in China, and they can get some natural resources. And so they instigate what is called the Manchurian Incident, where they say, oh, these Chinese people have attacked Japan. They blew up part of our railroad. It's the Mukden incident. They blew up part of our railroad. Therefore, we need to go invade China and conquer and kill them all. And so they claim that happened, and that's kind of how the war over in the East gets begun. Japan enjoys phenomenal initial success. The United States and other powers threaten them with sanctions, and Japan just continues to roll over other countries, pushing out the Dutch in some places, the British in other places, the French in other places, just pushing them out. And it kind of sets them up with this idea that any foreign invader will be easily dealt with and easily pushed out of the way. And so when it comes to their views towards the United States, they think that the United States is going to be just like these other European countries. Some of the leaders in Japan are afraid of the United States. Japan does not have plans to invade the United States in World War II, at least not initially. They'll attack some Aleutian Islands up in Alaska, but they were very wary to invade the mainland of the United States because they thought that everybody in the United States had guns in their homes. And invading the country, they thought, would be like invading a land where every citizen was like a soldier. And so they were kind of wary of invading the mainland. They just wanted to push the United States out of Asia by taking the Philippines and push the United States out of the Pacific theater. And they hoped to do that by not only taking the Philippines and other places, but by knocking out the United States Pacific Fleet stationed at Pearl Harbor. And so on December 7th, 1941, the Empire of Japan will suddenly and viciously attack the United States forces at the Empire of Japan, or at Pearl Harbor. And that will bring the United States into World War II, and not long after the United States declares war on Japan, Germany will declare war on the United States, and it's now the United States is fighting a two-front war, and will be split between the two theaters. Interestingly enough, looking back, we tend to view World War II as everybody wanted to go fight the Germans because they were the really bad guys. Turns out the Japanese aren't very good either. But most people, after December 7th, wanted to go fight in the Pacific. They wanted to go fight the Japanese. It was the Japanese who attacked the United States, who did a sneak attack. You know, they didn't even have the decency to declare war first. Although, in war, I don't know why you would tell people you're going to attack them first. It was just... There was no provocation. It was just all of a sudden you attack. Anyway, everybody wanted to go fight the Japanese. And so many people volunteered, hoping to go to the Pacific theater. Some were disappointed when they get sent to the European theater. And then history tends to make a much more to do about the European theater than the Pacific. It turns out that they're both equally nasty. And both are equally vicious and bloody, and it's just terrible all the way around. There's not a good place to be during World War II. The Japanese, we talked about the Einsatzgruppen. You might want to maybe look down and take notes for just this page. The Japanese did very similar things that the Germans did, except there were never any parades for the conquering Japanese. Everybody knew it was going to be bad. Here you have a newspaper clipping from a magazine that will be printed for the Japanese soldiers and printed in several different, distributed in several different places. In Nanjing, at the time, which was the capital of China, Chiang Kai-shek's forces had been driven out, and the Japanese had a contest, two Japanese soldiers had a contest to see who could behead the most Chinese in a day. And they wound up killing around 200 people during their beheading contest. And it proudly proclaims, this article, this title and subtitle, proudly proclaimed the winner and the champion beheader of the Japanese army, the occupation forces in Nanjing. The right picture, we call it Nanking, it's actually Nanjing. The right-hand picture, you have Japanese soldiers using captured Chinese soldiers for bayonet practice. It's not enough to use the hay-filled dummies or rubber molds in order to practice using your bayonet. They decided that it would be better if you could have real human beings to stab, and so they would take Chinese soldiers and try to keep them alive as long as possible. You know, you practice stabbing them in the arm for a while, then you practice stabbing them in the foot or the leg for a while, and it's only after you have thoroughly practiced using your bayonet on them that you would practice trying to kill people with it. Total, absolute disregard for human life. Horrible, terrible. It should never happen again. Incidentally, the Japanese government has never apologized, ever, for what they would do to the Chinese. In Nanjing, which is one city, they would kill over 300,000 civilians after the war, after they took the city. So the Chinese forces get into a battle, and then they flee, and the soldiers that were stationed in Nanjing
flee, hopefully to come back later. And when they do that, the civilian population is decimated. 300,000 people killed in just this one city within the matter of a few months. And it wasn't systematic like it was necessarily with the Germans, but it was systemic, in which the Japanese would go around and just randomly kill people and torture people and do unspeakable things to women and children, and it was just terrible. It was terrible. In some instances, they would remove the limbs from women so that they couldn't get away from the soldiers when they were trying to do things to them. It was just absolutely terrible. And again, this shows us the depths of depravity that people are capable of when they are taught and learn to use hatred and fear as motivation, and when they are taught that other races of people, which do not exist, there's no such thing as races, when other races of people are less than human. This is what happens. We have to make sure it never happens again. No matter how terrible and how horrible our enemies may ever be, they always have to be viewed as human. We cannot allow ourselves to view them as things as being less than human, or we may find ourselves guilty of some of these same terrible atrocities. Some famous pictures that can help us learn some important lessons from World War II. This is in 1940 when the Germans are rolling into Paris. This woman here is clapping. She's glad they're there. This man is crying. It would maybe be the other way around. You know, you tend to think, oh, the man would be the belligerent, the man would want the war. This man is crying because he recognizes the terrible things that are coming. And the city of the Renaissance, the city of art, the city of culture, the city of thinking, of philosophy, is about to suffer terribly at the hands of barbarians. And he recognizes that. And so we need to learn that not everybody is good. Not everybody wants to do what's right. Some people like destruction. Some people are foolish and they don't understand what comes when terrible, immoral, amoral people are in control. This guy did. He understood that everything that was good was about to be tested. Another picture. This is from the Normandy beaches on D-Day, June 6, 1944, the invasion of the Normandy, and the massive effort that is required for good to succeed. It is not easy to defeat evil. It has never been easy to defeat evil. In order to defeat evil, ultimately, God had to pay a very high price. He had to send His Son. In order for us to fight evil in our life, you should never expect it in your personal life to be easy. It will be a constant battle. It will take all of your willpower. It will take all of your strength. To fight evil in the world, it will take everything that we've got. For good people to win, they must be willing to stand up and fight for what is right. If you do not stand up, if you do not fight for what is right, then evil will win. The darkness will overcome. And so we have to be those who will stand up, not only for what is right, but for what is good. Not only for what is right, but against what is evil, so that God may be glorified in what we do and the strength with which we do it. This another kind of ripple effect that will come from World War II is that women will kind of be empowered throughout the world. It will happen in different ways in different places, but these women fought in the 1077th Anti-Aircraft Regiment in the Battle of Stalingrad. They weren't the only ones there, but their regiment, filled with many women, would hold off an entire tank division on their own, destroying 83 tanks, 15 APCs, 3 battalions of infantry, and shooting down 14 aircraft. They all died in the process, so these 2 women died in the Battle of Stalingrad. But they proved, and other women, maybe not necessarily soldiers, maybe factory workers, perhaps back in the United States, Rosie the Riveter and all that, women prove they can fight when necessary and they can work when necessary. They're equal to men in dignity and in character and in strength and integrity. They're equal to men. There are different roles that have been assigned, but those roles do not mean that one is more important or better than the other, and that the war kind of hammered that home again. It kind of reminded the world that women are important, and women can be brave, and women can be strong. This picture ought to remind us of the terrible things that happen in war, the terrible things that happen when nobody will stand up and do what's right. Again, most of the people, most of the Jews who wind up being sent to concentration camps were betrayed by their friends, by their neighbors. This woman is going on what is called the last walk. She is walking with her 4 children down the pathway to the showers at Birkenau. They will be killed. Most of the Jews who are killed in the concentration camps are children. The men would be taken for labor. Some of the women would be taken for labor. Some will be worked to death. Some will survive. But children are usually executed or killed right away as soon as they get off the train. And so these people had to endure the hardship of riding in the rail car. Many people will die on the rail car train ride to the camps. They get to the camps, again, with that sign that says, "Work will set you free." They are taken down to shower, and the shower is full of cyanide gas, and they will die. It's very, very disturbing. It's very sickening to think of what people are capable of doing to other people. And ultimately, this is one of the most important lessons from World War II that we need to keep in mind, especially now as we seem to be dealing with other evil people and wicked people who have no remorse at taking human life in some of the most graphic and terrible ways possible. This little girl had to deal with things and had to live through things that nobody should have to deal with. And she is able, in a sense, to maintain her hope, to keep a shred of her innocence. Notice that she made it a point to dig through the rubble and to find her doll. Her home is sitting in ruins. We're unaware of what happened to the rest of her family, but she made it a point to find her doll and to take care of the doll and to comfort her doll. And so out of the darkness, we may not come unscathed, but we must come intact, remembering that we have great work to do, that there are many important things that we must do, and that the sacrifice and the price is worth it. To get evil out of our lives is worth any price. To make sure that good overcomes the darkness, that the light overcomes the darkness, that good overcomes the evil, it's worth any price. And we have to keep that hope, we have to keep that dignity, and we have to keep that focus, and we have to just maintain our innocence when the darkness comes. It won't be easy, it will be very difficult, but that's what has to happen. Next time we'll talk about the Cold War, and we'll see how the Cold War is born right out of the end of World War II. And we'll look at some of the lasting effects that we can feel today from the Cold War. And so I'll see you guys then.